Hi and welcome to a new and also follow-up video about the Generation 4 NVMe drives. In one of my previous videos we were testing if there is a benefit of a single Generation 4 NVMe drive over a Generation 3 NVMe drive, and the conclusion was that usually or typically it doesn't make much sense to get a Generation 4 drive over a Generation 3 drive right now, taking the price into account. But in today's video we are going to test RAID0 with two Generation 4 drives and try to get the maximum speed currently available with two drives on this platform. For X570 we can select between RAID0 and RAID1. RAID0 is basically doubling your capacity and also doubling the performance because we can access both drives at the same time, can read and write at the same time to the individual drives, which is doubling the capacity, also doubling the performance. So going, for example, from the XPG drive from, in theory, 5000 megabyte per second read, we are going to 10,000 megabyte per second read. Obviously, if we're testing this, it will be a little bit lower, but that's the direction we're heading to. One thing you have to keep in mind that you're not only doubling the performance, you're also doubling the risk. If you have a failure rate of, let's say, 0.1% of a drive within the first 3 years, which I think should be kind of typical, could be higher, but it means 1 out of 1,000 drives will fail within 3 years. And let's say you're using 2 drives, then you're doubling your failure rate. And if you're moving to 8 or 16 drives, you're exponentially increasing your failure rate. That's something you always have to keep in mind if you're going for RAID0. With RAID1, you mirror your drives. So 2 1 terabyte drives will result in still 1 terabyte, but you basically have always a mirror image of your drive. So if one fails, all your data is still there. That's something you should do or could do if you're aiming for data security. On X570 we have multiple boards that allow up to 3 M.2 drives, but you have to keep in mind not all of them might be Generation 4 M.2 slots, and even if they are, you're still potentially running into a bottleneck. Typical configuration will be that the top slot will be connected to your CPU, that will be Generation 4, and then you could have, in theory, 2 more slots with Generation 4 attached to your chipset, to X570. But then your chipset is only connected with 4 Generation 4 lanes to your CPU. So if you're running 2 of those drives over the chipset and then to the CPU, you're running in a bottleneck of the Generation 4 PCI Express lanes. That's why, in my opinion, it doesn't really make much sense to use 3 drives, for example, and hook them up to CPU and 2 on chipset, because then if you're aiming for the highest transfer rate, you're running into a bottleneck. Let's quickly talk about how we're going to configure RAID0 on X570. Obviously a difference from your main board. It might look different in, let's say, an MSI BIOS or in a Gigabyte BIOS, but the process should be very similar. First step for the ASUS BIOS is go to SATA configuration and enable NVMe RAID mode here. Then you just hit F10, apply the setting and go back into the BIOS. Then you will have the RAID Expert 2 configuration utility right on the bottom in the advanced menu. You can enter this one. Then we have controller management, array management, physical disk management. If we go to physical disk management, you could see your drives by view physical disk properties. You can see we have 2 drives with 1 terabyte each, and both say ready in the end. That's important, otherwise it would not be possible to create an array. What do we have to do now? So we go to array management, create array. Then we can select what kind of RAID we want to initialize. You have RAIDable, RAID0, RAID1. I think RAIDable was some kind of function where you could prepare your drive to do RAID later, but that's something I never used personally. Not sure why you would want to use it. I think you should probably decide right at the start if you're getting 2 drives, and then you just go for RAID0 or RAID1, whatever you want to do. In our case, we were going for RAID0. Then we go to select physical drives or disks. That's where we select our NVMe drives. We're going for SSD as media type. Select both of the NVMe drives with 1 terabyte. Apply changes. Now you see the array size changed to 2 terabyte because we're adding up the 2 drives in total. That's what happens with RAID0. With RAID1 we would have only 1 terabyte here. Then we have the cache tag size set to 256 kilobyte. I think this is like the stripe size. basically tells the smallest piece of information that's split up between the drives. And I think the higher you select this, the higher your performance for, let's say, large data. And if you have a ton of extremely small files, then it's in theory faster. If you're going, for example, 64 kilobyte, you might have to test that in your individual case. But I think for the typical average user, let's say for gaming, for video editing, the 256 should be the best configuration. Read cache, write cache, I would leave exactly like this. Then go to create array. That's basically it. Now we already created our RAID0. We can see that at manage array properties, select array, you can see RAID0 1.9 terabyte is available. Hit F10, apply the settings, and then we will do the Windows installation. Usually I wouldn't bug you with the Windows installation, but with the RAID array it's a little bit different. That's why I'm just going to show you how to do the RAID installation. First of all, you see the overview with the different drives. You can see 4 positions right here, but don't touch anything. Don't delete anything, don't format or create any drives. That will just cause additional trouble and you would have to create your array again in BIOS. So don't touch anything, just go to the bottom left part where you can load your RAID driver. The RAID driver is available as download on your mainboard's manufacturer website. Once you extracted your RAID driver to a USB drive, you can find 3 different folders in there. It's RC bottom, config and RAID. Now it's important to install those different RAID drivers in the correct order. The order is bottom, controller and config, or going by the folders, it's bottom, RAID and config. While loading the different drivers, it's quite normal that your drives will disappear. No worries, just continue loading the drivers until you installed all 3 of them, and then you should see the RAID array with 2 terabyte and you can continue with the Windows installation. I'm in Windows, installed my basic tools like Chrome and Adobe Premiere, everything that I will need for testing later. Already running CrystalDiskMark right now, also have hardware info open at the same time, mainly because if you're running CrystalDiskMark like I did right now, you can see I have 4,600 megabyte per second roughly in read and 8,300 megabyte per second in write. Which is really interesting, because if you run this like 4, 5, 6, 7 times, then you also get read peaks that are much higher. My highest peak in read so far was 9,435 and write was 8,873. So there seems to be some kind of fluctuation in read and write. But what's kind of cool, or what I can recommend, is if you're running CrystalDiskMark, just keep hardware info open at the same time, because then you can check read and write data right here, which is a cool indicator because you cannot see it during the run in CrystalDiskMark. But now you can see it's at least 5,000 megabyte per second right now. It seems to be fluctuating quite a lot, not really sure why. What's also interesting in hardware info, typically if you're not running a RAID array, you can check the temperature of the drives, which is kind of a problem with Gen 3 and Gen 4 drives, especially if you put them under very high load. Let's say you're running 30 times sequential read-write. That's a very high load for those drives. And as I told you earlier, I removed the heatsinks of those S50s to fit them underneath the heatsinks of my mainboard. If you're doing that, it's already buffering quite a lot, because you have this high mass of the heatsinks on your SSDs. That mass is much higher than this stock heatsink, and then it's already compensating quite a lot. In CrystalDiskMark, if you're running few sequential read-writes, that's totally fine. If you're planning to run like, I don't know, 30, 40 runs in a row like I did in my last test, you should have some kind of active cooling on those drives. Like I'm currently having a 120mm fan pointed towards the SSDs. If you're doing that, there will never be an issue. If you run them passive with no airflow, you should avoid running like 30 sequential read-writes just for normal usage. Let's say you're gaming, even Adobe Premiere, everything is totally fine. There will be no issues whatsoever. But if you're planning to do some, I don't know, extreme loads for those drives, you should be aware that cooling could potentially be a problem. You can see now it increased to almost 6 gigabyte per second read. Write is still 8200, so it's fluctuating quite a bit. Not entirely sure why, but yeah, you can see the read now really increased. At least I could see a peak here. That's funny. So I could see a peak in hardware info with 9465, but CrystalDiskMark is only showing 5000 megabyte per second. It should be higher. Maybe it's a readout problem in CrystalDiskMark, but you can see performance is here. Just double check with hardware info and you should be good. Let's take a look at some benchmarks I performed, and they're kind of connected to my previous generation for NVMe drive video. I reran most of my tests, again CrystalDiskMark RAID, but this time I included a Samsung 970 EVO 1TB, because in previous video a lot of people were complaining why I was running the tests with a 960 EVO with only 250 GB and not like 1 TB, but yeah, you know, if I don't have the drive here, it doesn't really make much sense to just buy a drive to have it in the chart, because the investment of this drive is higher than the revenue of the YouTube adverts, so it doesn't really make much sense for me. Still, so many people were complaining, so I reran all my tests with the Samsung 970 EVO 1 TB to give you a better insight of what kind of performance benefits you're getting from a Gen 4 drive. You can see on the bottom the Crucial MX500, which is a normal SATA drive, 2.5 inches, 550 megabyte per second, followed by the 960 EVO 250 GB with about 3200 megabyte per second, followed by the 970 EVO 1 TB with about 3600 megabyte per second. Then we have the two Generation 4 NVMe drives from Aorus and Corsair with 5000 megabyte per second. And on top, you can see the ADATA XPG S50 in the RAID0 configuration with almost double the performance of one drive, which is kind of expected or what we were hoping to. Peak was 9435 megabyte per second. Looking at the write rate, you're also doubling the performance. Again, you can see the Generation 4 drives from Aorus and Corsair about 4300 megabyte per second, and then the ADATA XPG S50 in RAID0 about 8900 megabyte per second. And those are really insane numbers comparing it to the price. So you're investing about 500 euro right here in Germany for those two drives, and getting like 9000 megabyte per second read and write is extremely solid, especially keeping in mind what you would pay for that. Let's say 3, 4, 5 years ago, you would have needed like extremely hardcore professional drives to get those speeds, or even multiple drives, which then exponentially increases your failure rate again. So that's not really a good thing, but keeping in mind what kind of investment this is, I think the performance is extremely solid. 4K video copy time, basically taking one of my YouTube videos with all the different files, so sound files, video files, pictures and everything, total I think like 30 or 40 different files with different file sizes, and then just do a copy test. You can see the Crucial MX500 on the bottom, the version with 250 GB, taking 278 seconds, followed by the 960 EVO with 250 GB, taking 117 seconds. You can see there's a huge gap, as you said in the previous video, obviously. It's not the generation that gives you the benefit here, it's because of the different capacity and using different components. That's why we shave off a lot of seconds, going to 48 seconds for the 970 EVO, then the two Generation 4 NVMe drives from Aorus and Corsair with 26 seconds, on top the ADATA XPG S50 with 18 seconds, so we saved another 8 seconds on the copy test. Adobe Premiere project loading time, that's basically the most critical factor running Adobe Premiere if you're doing rendering performance, because the SSD doesn't have such an influence on just the rendering itself, or during the process when you're cutting the video, there is not really a big influence of your SSD, but the project loading time, if you're loading all the different files in Adobe Premiere and you're like loading all the peak files from the audio, this is where an NVMe drive really helps, what you can see here. For example, the Crucial MX500 on the bottom, the SATA drive takes 73 seconds, and you save already almost 20 seconds just by moving to an NVMe drive. Even the 960 EVO with only 250 GB helps a lot. Moving to the 970 EVO with 1 TB gives you 52 seconds, and about 50 seconds for the NVMe Generation 4 drives, and on top we have 45 seconds for RAID0. So there's not that much of a benefit going from Generation 4 to two Generation 4 drives. It's not that you're going from 50 to 25 seconds. You can see we're saving another 5 seconds. PUBG game loading time, from my personal experience, I know that there is a benefit going from an HDD to an SSD, but once you have an SSD, it seems to not really matter anymore. You can see all the different drives only took 14 seconds to load the game, so no benefit whatsoever. Going to Shadow of the Tomb Raider game loading, you can see you can save a little bit of time going from a normal SATA drive to the NVMe drive with 250 GB, the 960 EVO. Then you're saving another 2 seconds. Percentage-wise, it's quite a lot, obviously 20%. That's not bad. But then once you have the Generation 4 drive, it seems like we're hitting the limit and there's no benefit anymore. So it doesn't matter if you're running the 970 EVO 1 TB or the Generation 4 drives from Aros or Corsair. And even RAID0 didn't do a difference. We're still only at 8 seconds, which I think personally is totally fine as a game loading time. Last test is X570 power consumption. I'm not really sure where this rumor came from that X570 in combination with RAID is resulting in an extremely high power consumption. When X570 came out, I performed this test where I was measuring the chipset power consumption of the chipset in different combinations with different drives, like Generation 3 versus Generation 4, and hooking up SATA drives and putting like a PCI Express graphics card on the chipset and everything. You can check that out in my previous video that was like 2 months ago, I think. And when I did that video, the only thing I didn't test was RAID on the chipset. Obviously, because the Crosshair 7 Hero doesn't have two M.2 slots connected to the chipset. That's why I cannot test RAID0 on the chipset itself. But it wouldn't even make sense to run this kind of configuration because you're saturating the Gen 4 link between your CPU and the chipset if you're running two Gen 4 drives of the chipset. That's why it wouldn't even make sense in the first place to run this configuration. That's why I don't see any point testing this. The only configuration that makes sense is having one drive on the CPU and one drive on the chipset and then link both into RAID. Let's take a look at the results. Idle power consumption of X570 with no drive attached is about 7.4 watt. It doesn't matter if you're attaching a single Gen 3 drive or a single Gen 4 drive. All of this, I would say, is within measurement tolerance. We're talking about 8.2 to 8.6 watt. Doesn't make any difference whatsoever. Also, you can see if you're running RAID0 on load on the chipset, you can see it's the highest here, but it's like 0.5 watt more than what we've seen before. So yeah, I don't really know where this rumor comes from. Like running RAID on the chipset doesn't like explode the power consumption of your chipset. It's not like it suddenly consumes 15, 16 watt out of nowhere if you're running a RAID on the chipset. That doesn't make sense whatsoever. So if you see this rumor again on the internet, please link them to this test. Then you can tell them you can run RAID on the chipset. It's not really a problem. You should always keep in mind that you should run one drive on the CPU and one drive of the chipset, because running 3 drives really doesn't make sense in my opinion. Okay, so what's the conclusion of Generation 4 NVMe RAID0? In my opinion, it really depends what you're trying to do. If you're just a gamer, you will not really feel the benefit of going from a single, let's say, high-end Gen 3 drive or high-end Gen 4 drive to RAID0 with Gen 4 drives. Like the game loading times won't really benefit. Even if we say it's a benefit of 20% in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it's still going from 10 to 8 seconds. And you're not gonna feel that, I think. If we would go from 40 to 20 seconds, then that would be a different story, but that's not the case. If you're performing, let's say, professional workloads with Adobe Premiere, if you're rendering a lot, if you have all those project loading times several times of a day, if you're copying a lot of files, it could make sense because it's still a fairly cheap option compared to, like, let's say, professional PCI Express drives that cost several thousand euros. Compared to that, this solution is quite nice. And sometimes, sometimes you just want to have the fastest things available, and in this regard, cannot say much against it. You can go for it and get 2 Generation 4 drives for NVMe. It's the same thing. We're going to cover that in a video series soon, because I couldn't help myself, but I spent, I think, total 5 or 6K just getting the Dominus Extreme and the 28-core Xeon. I always loved those very exclusive platforms, let's say the SR2 from EVGA, Intel Skull Trail, all of those I own, and for me this kind of belongs there. And sometimes you waste a lot of money for things you don't need but you want. And it's the same thing with having 2 Generation 4 NVMe drives. If you're a gamer, it really does not make sense, but it's cool. In that regard, if you want to have it, you can buy it. Otherwise, doesn't really make much sense. Thanks for joining in. See you next time. Bye.